Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. Ayala. This is 13.1. The North and South take different paths, condensed. So let's look at our objectives. You will be able to identify the sectional differences between the North and the South, how and why the North took different paths, and how this will bring us towards this union and a civil war. You'll also be able to explain the issues surrounding the Compromise of 1850. So to start off, let's do a little bit of review and some more background knowledge on the North versus the South. So the North is a very industrial society. They embraced the factory system. They had larger cities with larger population density. They had a lot of internal improvements or infrastructure like canals, railroads, telegraph lines, roadways, and a lot of immigration. Because people from around the world will see all these employment opportunities at these factories, and they're going to move where the jobs are. You're not going to stay in one place if there's no job or no economic opportunity. You're going to go to the places that pull you in because of their jobs. Just like how Florida and this area of Florida in particular, the Space Coast, we have a lot of aerospace jobs, and with NASA, SpaceX, so people with those type of backgrounds have a tendency to move here. And overall, the North didn't like slavery. They didn't like the idea of not paying people for their labor because of their background in Christianity, their ideas of capitalistic society, and how everyone should have the right to have their own money and their own wages based upon what they do for a living. They are still considered racist by modern standards. A lot of the Northerners thought people who were not white or Caucasian were beneath them or lesser. Later, this will change, and this will change quite swiftly to be about the lack of education. That really education is what makes people equal. The South is a little bit different. It's an extremely agricultural society, in particular with cash crops like cotton. It was controlled by very few wealthy planters. We call this more of an oligarchical society because a few wealthy families control the majority of society. And they also had the majority of slaves. The majority of the people in the South were that were free were what were known as yeoman farmers. They had very small farms and maybe 1 to 0 slaves. But it was still a race-based class system. So the poor whites would say things, well, at least I'm not a slave. At least I'm not like that person. And the idea is they used this race to separate society. And it was a way to control these slaves. Their economy also will concentrate on exports, in particular agricultural products like cotton. So later, when we talk about the Civil War, because they focus on exporting, they don't have any internal way to make weapons. They have no internal ways to make clothing. There's very few internal improvements. There's very, very few railroads. Very, very few canals. Because you got to remember, if you're exporting products, and in particular if it's cotton, it's not a heavy product. You can put it on a barge and just push it down a river. You don't have to really build a train to haul iron ore or even later steel. And there'd be a large economic disparity. How the wealthy planter class worked and lived versus the average American in the South who were poor farmers were completely different. And then you have those on the very bottom, like the slaves and the Native Americans, who had no rights in the South. And the differences between the North with their industrial economy and their slavery attitude versus the South with their extreme reliance on slavery and agriculture is going to have two different societies that are going to clash. Even though we live under one U.S. Constitution, the different in lifestyles, the difference in how they thought will come to a point that we're like about to come to arms against each other. And we will. Then we get to the Compromise of 1850. And really the focus of this is what to do with all these new territories from the Mexican-American War. Because if you remember, all the way back when we went over the Missouri Compromise, that we created a line underneath Missouri that anything north of it would become free states, anything south would become slaves. But as we spoke about earlier, that gives a lot more geographic land to the free slaves than the slave states. And that would make the balance of power in Congress shift towards too much to the free states. And the South did not like that. So what happens is Senator Henry Clay from Kentucky a southern state, and Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois, a northern state, lead the charge for compromise. There's going to be two major provisions. For the North, California will come in as a free state, and Washington, D.C. will outlaw slave trade. So, because what was happening is D.C., what we would call, the capital of the free world, you could literally walk out the White House and see men and women being sold. And it just looked really, really bad, in particular to these European powers who already got rid of slavery, like France or England. And the South, what they get in is they get that the Congress will not pass any laws banning slavery in the new territories, as in the Missouri Compromise will be gone. How are they going to deal with that? Well, we'll talk about that later. And the South also will get a very strong fugitive slave law, which we're going to look at in the next section. And as always, don't forget to be awesome.